It was a common expression during the war that more soldiers were killed by vaccine shots than by shots from enemy guns. Very few people realize that the worst epidemic ever to hit America, the Spanish influenza of 1918, was the after effect of a massive nationwide vaccine campaign. Viruses were not well known at the time, so the doctors told the people the disease was caused by germs. Germs, bacteria, and viruses are the scapegoats, which the doctors like to blame for the things they do not understand. If we check back in history to the 1918 flu period, we will see that it suddenly struck just after the end of World War I, when American soldiers were returning home from overseas. There was a suggestion that the virus strain originated at Fort Riley, Kansas, in viruses in poultry and pigs, which the fort bred for food, and the soldiers were then sent from Fort Riley around the world, where they spread the disease. World War I was the first war in which multiple vaccines were forced on all U.S. servicemen. This concoction of poisonous drugs and putrid proteins of which the vaccines were composed caused such a widespread disease and death among the soldiers that it was common talk of the day that more of our men are being killed by medical shots than by enemy gunfire. U.S. Army records show that 7 men dropped dead after being vaccinated. A report from U.S. Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson not only verified these deaths, but also stated that there had been 63 deaths and 28,585 cases of hepatitis as a direct result of yellow fever vaccination during only 6 months of war, and that was only one of a couple dozen shots given to recruits. Army records also reveal that after vaccination became compulsive in the U.S. Army in 1911, not only did typhoid increase rapidly, but all other vaccinal diseases increased at an alarming rate. After America entered the war in 1917, the death rate from typhoid vaccination rose to the highest point in the history of the U.S. Army. The report of the Surgeon General of the U.S. Army shows that during 1917, there were admitted into the Army hospitals 19,608 men suffering from anti-typhoid inoculation and vaccinia. The Army doctors knew all these cases of disease and death were due to vaccination and were honest enough to admit it in their medical reports. It is known that vaccines often cause other diseases besides the ones which they are given. For instance, smallpox vaccine often causes syphilis, paralysis, leprosy, and cancer. Polio shots, diphtheria toxin antitoxin, typhoid vaccine, as well as measles, tetanus, and most other shots often cause various other stages of disease such as post-vaccinal encephalitis, paralysis, spinal meningitis, blindness, cancer, tuberculosis, arthritis, kidney disease, heart disease, and even heart failure. Nerve damage and many other serious conditions also follow the injections. When doctors had tried to suppress the symptoms of the typhoid with a stronger vaccine, it caused a worse form of typhoid, which they named paratyphoid. But when they concocted a stronger and more dangerous vaccine to suppress that one, they created an even worse disease, which they didn't have a name for. What should they call it? They didn't want to tell people what it really was, their own Frankenstein monster which they had created with their vaccines and their suppressive medicines. They wanted to direct the blame away from themselves, so they called it Spanish influenza. After the war, this was one of the vaccines used in a vain attempt to protect the panic-stricken world from the soldiers returning from World War I battlefronts infected with dangerous diseases. The only ones who would ultimately escape the influenza were those who refused the vaccinations. The doctors didn't want this massive vaccine disease blunder to reflect on them, so they agreed amongst themselves to call it Spanish influenza. Spain was a neutral country during World War I, with no reporting restrictions, so the idea of citing the outbreak there seemed to be a good way for the medics to distance themselves from any scandal. The Spanish resented having the scourge planted on them, as they knew the flu did not originate in their country. The 1918 flu was the most devastating disease in history. and it brought forth a profusion of medical tricks to try and control it. But the administering of poisons, contaminated vaccines only worsened the weakened condition of people, and the treatments ended up killing exponentially more people than the flu itself. It is estimated that the 1918 flu epidemic killed around 50 million people throughout the world, or as far away as the vaccinations reached. The truth of the matter is that most died from the crude and deadly vaccinations administered by their doctors, or their immune capabilities were so compromised by these inoculations that they died from the first germs that took hold. This is why young men in their 20s were such a high mortality demographic during this pandemic.